I want to talk about the visionary approach to strategy from Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. I'm reading this book and really loving it. So, the four different approaches depend on how changeable your environment is, as well as how unpredictable your environment is. So when your environment is both completely predictable and you can't really change it, that's when the classical approach to strategy makes sense. And that's just gain scale, reduce cost, grow market share. When your strategy is very unpredictable, we can't really change things, that's when adaptive strategy makes sense, and I went into that. When your strategy is both, or when your situation is both unpredictable and you can change it, that's when the shaping approach comes in. But today we're going to talk about the innovation approach. So this is when your strategy, or when your situation is both very predictable but you can really change it. So that's where innovation makes sense. And so where have you heard this before? So innovation is generally associated with startups and let's call it disruptors. So your iPhone, where Steve Jobs combined music and a phone, which nowadays seems so blasé, but back then when he created that was obviously no one had ever thought about it, and that made the iPhone basically the standard by which phones are measured today. Another one that the book mentions would be 23andMe, which is an interesting one, mapping the human genome. And the book goes into and this is a constant innovator's dilemma, is now 23andMe is an ancestry company where it maps your DNA and finds out kind of where you came from and stuff like that, and that's how it's promoted. But at first they were thinking it was going to be more of a healthcare related company. So you start off with why is this innovation even necessary? And even going back to the iPhone, why the hell would you want your phone and your music in one place? And now that is so apparent to us, right? You just take your phone everywhere. You listen to it when you're running on headphones. You can make calls, and obviously the iPhone is a platform now for doing a lot of different things. But back then that wasn't taken for granted. So an innovator has to really be able to change their environment, and that's what this disruption is all about. E-commerce, Amazon is an obvious one. You remember, or I remember certainly in the mid 90s when the internet was first coming to prominence, a lot of people saw the e-commerce trend, but retailing on commerce, Amazon's the first one who really got it right. There were not a million, but there were a lot of companies, back in the late 90s, whether it's pets.com or diapers.com, they were going to sell certain things on the internet, but no one was really able to bring it to scale kind of prior to Amazon. UPS is one that the book mentions that saw that e-commerce trend, coming on early, and they partnered with eBay and were able to gain a 60% market share as of the writing of this book, which is around 2012, in the e-commerce market. And obviously things change, because I don't know that that's true today, and Amazon is actually one of their competitors in the e-market delivery space. Uber would be a great example. Predictable environment. How predictable were cabs when Uber first came onto the scene? Well, they completely changed that and disrupted the ride share space and the cab space by introducing ride share. Bitcoin would be another one. Money is very predictable. Bitcoin is betting that, and they're not really a company, but they're betting that they can change how currency is delivered in order to prevent governments from debasing their currency and making transactions a lot easier. It remains to be seen if in 20 years we'll sit there back and go, yeah, of course we use cryptocurrency. That's how everything is done. It's not apparent today that that's going to be what happens, but we'll see what happens 20 years from now. So one thing to bear in mind is the visionary environment is not the most common by any means for every single thing. You often hear that, here's this new startup that's trying to disrupt, this or disrupt that industry, disrupt insurance, disrupt banking, yada, yada, yada. Well, they don't always work out, and that is often because people don't want that change, and the vision that the startup founder has isn't what the customer ends up wanting. So, one of the risks is seeing a visionary environment in something where it doesn't exist. But, that could just be that the founder isn't the right person to sell that. I mean, who knows, if Steve Jobs hadn't came along, would we still be, have our cell phones that don't play music? I don't know, maybe. So I think there is definitely, it has to be something that the customer wants, but you've also got to be able to turn it into something the customer wants, and make your offering something that customers actually value. So the next part of the, let me get my notes. That's a problem with these things. Okay, so the other thing about a visionary approach is, you have to have an endpoint, but be flexible in how you get there. And the book says a lot of mistakes that companies make in a visionary approach is they try and plan for it like a classical environment. You try and do a strategic budget and forecast for the next year, and that just doesn't work because you have an end goal, but you've got to be completely flexible in how you get there. I brought up 23andMe earlier. Well, I don't know that it's that the founder had an idea. She certainly didn't have the idea that it was going to be a genetic mapping ancestry company, and I don't know that when that came along, but she had a real she knew that genomics would be important and would come in use somehow, and that's how it ended up working out for her. But she eventually had an end game, the use of genomics as an everyday usable approach for your ordinary customers, but was very flexible in how she actually got there. So another standard of a visionary approach is, okay, what strategies do you need to approach assuming you are in a visionary environment? Well, number one is move fast. You've got to gain scale before all of your competitors jump into the market. Now, competitors jumping into the market is not as a big of a deal as it might seem, because a lot of competitors, they're in this space, but they don't necessarily see what you're doing as something that's actually going to work, and they're skeptical. And they're also, large companies, it takes them a while to make changes. So, this is where niche companies in a market can really take advantage of the fact that their larger competitors, aren't going to necessarily adopt what they're doing very quickly. But if it takes too long and your competitors do see it coming, well, they can, jump into this space and take advantage of that. On the other hand, what normally happens with visionary companies is larger companies, if the vision seems to be working, will go ahead and buy them. And that's, they mentioned, GE does, like something like 100 acquisitions a year. Google, Amazon, they all do a ton of acquisitions. And that's what they're doing, is taking advantage. Now that they're large companies and almost classical companies are taking advantage of, other innovative companies to bring innovation into their own company. So important to move fast, but you can overestimate how fast your competitors will actually, the large competitors in the space will actually try and jump into what you're doing. You want to set industry standards. So, the iPhone, the App Store is very innovative, and they actually, I'm going to discuss that when we talk about a shaping approach, because that's more of their strategy is more shaping, but they definitely set the standard for, how mobile phone devices work with, both talk, text, music, and apps on it. And again, that's more of a shaping environment, but they definitely set the industry standard there. You can also, you also need to influence customer preferences if you're in an innovative environment. You need to talk to customers about why what you're doing is necessary and why they actually want it. Steve Jobs often talked about, he didn't care about going and asking customers what they wanted, but by the time you built it, their preferences would change. It's kind of like he was skating to where the puck was going. Henry Ford once said, if I asked customers what they wanted, they'd say a faster horse. And that was true back then. So you've got to envision where the puck is going, but you've also got to sell customers on the idea that they need what you're selling. So that's an important feature. In a classical environment, customer preferences and meeting customer demands is a lot more important. In a visionary, it's much more creating the customer demand and setting what their preferences should be, if that makes sense. Also, setting the industry standard, going back to that, would be, what's a good example of that? Well, for years, if you were making a copy of a paper, nowadays you scan it on your phone, but if you were using a machine to make a copy of a piece of paper, what would you say? You'd say, I'm making a Xerox, even if you were using a Canon or a Minolta copier. And that's because Xerox set the standard way back in the 70s when they first made scanners, copy machines. What do you say when you do a computer search? No matter what you're doing, you say you're doing a Google search. And there are other search engines, but no matter what you say, even if you're using Yahoo or DuckDuckGo or whatever, you're going to say I'm doing a Google search. And that's because Google set the standard on search engines. So the innovative approach, or the visionary approach rather, it's for when you've got an extremely predictable environment. That's why extremely predictable environments are so ripe for innovators to come in with a visionary approach and attack them and disrupt them, is because they are very predictable. But it's got to be also an environment where you can change it. And that's the mistake, not a mistake a lot of startups make, because obviously there's risk that if you have a visionary approach, no one's gonna take it. But if you do have a visionary approach that customers will take, you've got to go in and be able to change the ecosystem and set the new standard and draw customers into your disruptive company as a result. So that's the visionary approach. Again, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. Very cool book.